and I welcome you on this new year to our first English podcast. And this is Knowledge Hub with Sanjay Analytical, and we are here with the usual suspect, Mr. Nilan. Nilan is my friend, and he's here. Hi, Nilan. How's New Year for you?
Hi, it was good. It was good. I was just going to say, I saw you right next to me on the suspects on the Rogues Gallery. So we're all the usual suspects here, right?
Yes, cool. So today the discussion is a bit political. So we thought we keep the Jets discussion, which was everybody's favorite, when we physically meet. So just a couple of weeks away until I get my studio ready and up. So today we'll discuss AKD and his visit to India and his upcoming visit to China. How that is gonna politically, the effect on geopolitics. So let's start with the Indian visit. So India was pretty much welcomed AKD in a grand fashion, and all over India there were posters, even in Sinhala language, which I thought it was quite special. And then there were some discussions happening back and forth, and there were some negotiations and agreements. So while that is going on, now people are asking. This was, in Sri Lankan culture, there was this notion where some of the population, some part of the population, despises India for some reason. I would like to know what's the reason behind that first, and then let's get into this particular contemporary issue. Up to you.
Okay, so if we can go into that Pandora's box and open it right away,
Yeah, let's do that.
I would. So typically, you find that whenever there's a big country and a bunch of smaller countries around. By the way, this applies to the Americans and the Canadians. It applies to the English and the Welsh and all that. It applies to the Chinese and the Vietnamese, and it also applies to the Indians and the Bangladeshi, Sri Lankans, blah, 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 where the smaller countries always view the bigger ones with a mix of an inferiority and a superiority complex. So the smaller countries will often look at these larger countries as dirty or corrupt or whatever, whatever. But at the same time, there will also be this imitation of them. So if I can give you an example, and I've used this example a lot in my lectures, we all know how many Sri Lankans try to or like to denigrate India as dirty and smelly and blah, 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 right? But at the same time, and I love pointing this out everywhere, go to any five-star hotel or luxury resort where there's a Colombo elite wedding going on, and they're all dressed up like the Bombay elite. Their rituals, they all have this Sangeet ritual now, which is what North Indian weddings have. They all do the
And
mehendi
Mehendi,
thing,
yeah.
right? Where the brown nonsense on their hands. So it's on the one hand, we have a superiority complex, but on the other hand, we also have an inferiority complex, which is a very, very tricky situation to get past. And you get this all over the world, where there's a big power and a smaller power, and they are culturally similar. So when there are cultural similarities, the
Okay.
small go on.
Yeah, I was just asking. So doesn't it? So in that case, US versus Mexico, it doesn't apply there.
No, so once again, the US versus Mexico dynamic is quite complex as well, but they don't see each other as part of the same civilizational continuum. So, we need to discuss Mexico as well, right? Because the Sri Lanka's biggest foreign policy blunder regarding India has been that we've always tried to be Latin America rather than Canada. See, you have this big
Wow.
economic power. You can either go hand in hand with them, and you can also become rich by going hand in hand with them, or you can do what Latin America did, which was to be perennially suspicious, to be perpetually paranoid of what they were going to do, and they remain a poor third world region with many poor third world countries.
Nilan, let
So,
me stop you right
yeah.
there. You used some pretty big words. I think the audience might need a little help grasping that. So, what do you call that?
Okay, so a perennial, so a everlasting, continuous. So basically, Latin America, for the last I don't know 70 years, has lived in a constant state of paranoia over the quote unquote West, particularly the evil Americans, particularly the evil CIA, Washington deep state, blah 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 blah. So whether this is Cuba, Venezuela, you can go through an entire roster of the Latin American
Yet they sell
countries.
all their drugs
This
to US.
Yeah, I mean, but once again, that is also a direct result of this reluctance to officially integrate with the American economy. So the things with demand, like drugs, end up creating black market economies and black market supply routes. So Latin America has always, despite being so close to the most powerful power center in recorded human history, Latin America still just as poor in most metrics as many other poor, quote unquote, poor parts of the world. Rampant law and order problems, rampant poverty, civil war out in the streets. I mean, even now, large parts of Mexico are not safe thanks to the civil war between the Sinaloa cartel, the Chapitos, and the Mayos. We'll have a separate podcast on the drug cartels and their wars and all that. But my point is that smaller nations often have a choice over whether they want to benefit from the rise of a large power or whether they want to stay suspicious. Unfortunately, our approach has been to stay suspicious, and the only ones who have lost out on because of this have been us. The Indians have not lost anything. We are the ones who are losing out on this everlasting state of paranoia and this inferiority superiority complex, unfortunately.
Okay, just to go on a little tangent, you said that America is the most powerful entity ever to exist in the recorded history.
Yeah.
Is that really true? Wasn't that any other ancient civilization like a big empire or something
I
like
mean,
that?
I can't think of any other empire that has the power to destroy the world 100 times over
Okay,
by
okay,
just clicking on a few buttons.
got it. All right, cool. Uh, so coming back to our issue, so inferiority and superiority complex. So there's a movement now happening. I mean, it's not that. I mean, we shouldn't be giving it that much attention anyway. But there's a. It's called India Lokuda. So is India big, right? So basically, they are questioning why the relationship between Sri Lanka and India and why we should treat India like our big brother. Should we treat India like our big brother?
I think we should treat India like a brother, right? I mean, whether it's a big brother or a small brother, those depend on the geopolitical calculations. See, at some point of time, when you have an alliance, now look at Israel and the United States. They've been allies for so long that in some cases today, Israel is the big brother. Right? If you look at intelligence sharing, for example, Israel is the one who takes the lead and provides most of the intelligence to the Americans. So once you have a long lasting partnership, in some cases, the bigger power will be the quote unquote big brother. In some cases, the smaller power, based on its niche specialization, will be able to lead the discussion. So I think we should see India as a brother, whether as a big brother or not. Let time sort all that out.
It's a case by case basis, you say.
A case by case basis and an issue by because it's not going to be one homogeneous partnership. We're going to be partnering with them on many different things. So in some things we might be the ones who take the lead. In some things they might be, obviously because of their size and stature and all that. In most things they would take the lead. But in terms of the mentality itself, I would say let's look at them as brothers rather than big brothers. Because the
Okay.
big brother concept also, remember, we have all this cultural baggage that we were just discussing. So let's look at them as brothers first and then figure out how the power is shared in the household.
So this animosity, as far as I know, I mean, it might be pretty much premature, but in 1988, was in the Indian peacekeeping force arriving in the country to assist us with tackling terrorism at that time. So is that where the animosity began, if there is one, or was it a remnant of the British colonial rule?
Yeah, so I would say a mix of these. So yes, it is true that when the IPKF came down and all that, the public opinion sank completely, right? That's true. But my point is that this is a cultural phenomenon we see everywhere, and
Mm,
this is simply a manifestation of that in this part of the world. Look, when you have a neighbor that big, and when we are this small, it's human nature for us to be cautious. It's human nature for there to be many, many different narratives where we're like, and let's face it, right? Once again, a big power will never remain innocent. Big power, it's not like the United States has not given Latin America reason to be paranoid, right? The United
mm,
States also has done a lot of things in Latin America we need to be critical
mm,
of.
mm,
Similarly, India has also done things here that we need to be critical of, right? So that will always be there. When you have a familial relationship and a territorial proximity, that will more or less always be there. The IPKF incident was one, but at the same time, the geopolitical setup itself is geared towards that. Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, Maldives, Sri Lanka. This will always be a cycle of ups and downs when we look at our relationship with India. It's not just this. You can see this in Bangladesh, the same inferiority superiority complex. You see this in Maldives. You even see it in some parts of Pakistan, particularly the parts of Pakistan in the Punjab province and all that, where many people here were born in India and many people on the Indian side were born on the Pakistani side and all
mm,
that. You still have a lot of cultural complexities that are being unraveled. So this is a phenomenon, I would say, in the whole subcontinent, not just between India and Sri Lanka.
okay. Um, so you said India is big, right? It's a big country. In what terms? Is it population wise, GDP wise? In what terms?
Population, GDP, size, diversity, potential, in terms of their investment capacity, in terms of both the size of the public sector and the size of the private sector, in terms of the media, right? There are something like 4,000, more than 4,000 Indian news channels. Just news channels alone, there are more than 4,000, right? So obviously, out of those 4,000, at least 400 will be nutcases who say all kinds of dumb stuff. You can't help it. Now, you really see this playing a negative role in India's relationship with many of its neighbors. I wrote
Mm,
an article for Strat News Global, which is the leading Indian defense
mm, mm,
website, news portal type place, on disinformation between India and Bangladesh, where the Indian media is playing a very destructive role
mm,
by
mm,
really hyping up the Bangladeshi regime change thing and all that
mm,
as some kind of second coming of ISIS.
mm,
And even though there are things happening in Bangladesh right now which are very
mm,
worrying in
mm,
terms of freedom of religion and the rights of Hindus and all that, there's no doubt that the Indian media, for the most part, grossly exaggerates what happens. But this is because of the size of the Indian media. There are reasonable voices, there are
mm,
unreasonable voices.
mm.
But because of the sheer scope, 4,000, you can put the rest of us together and you will not get that many news channels, right? I'm talking about television
Mm,
news
mm,
channels that you can see on TV, not like
mm.
the YouTube
So how do
podcasts
they
and all
remember
that
all
would be
these
even more.
numbers on the television, channel numbers and everything?
So
No idea.
yeah, I mean, yeah, no idea. I mean, I'm guessing you just go to a random number and you hope, right? But anyway, so obviously there will be state media as well. So, for
Mm.
example, in Tamil Nadu, there will be 2 dozen, 3 dozen news channels. In Karnataka, 2 dozen, 3 dozen
Ah,
Kannada
this is in addition to
channels.
those 4,000, is it?
Yes, yes. So the entire thing is worth about 4,000
Mm,
television channels alone. These
mm.
are dedicated 24-hour television news channels.
And then
I'm
you
not
have the
even
radio
going into
channels,
the
and you have, yeah,
podcasts and yeah, podcasts, magazines, right?
radios, yeah, papers,
Yeah.
newspapers.
Yeah. This is
Okay.
just those that have a television license from
Mm,
the Media and Broadcasting Ministry. Over 4,000.
mm. So these are not all. These are all digital, right? Not analog.
Yeah, I mean it's on TV,
Mm,
so
mm.
I'm assuming it's
Yeah.
digital. Yeah,
Yeah,
at this
they
point.
switch
I mean,
to
I'm not too.
they switch to the digital frequencies.
Yeah.
Okay, right. So India is there. So why does it matter? I mean, okay, there's a big country, a neighboring country that is just above us, where we can actually, some say we can swim there. I don't know whether that is true or false, but having big economy, big market just above us, or a big military power per se now, it's a superpower in its own sense. Why does it matter to the neighboring countries? What can we gain from having that?
So first
And
of
what can
all,
we lose also?
yeah, okay, okay. So let's go with the issue. So should we start with the nightmare or the paradise? Should we start with the?
Let's start with the nightmare, because we should end with the paradise always.
Okay, good, good, right? So I like that positive thinking. So if we can go with the negatives, the first thing when we deal with any major power is we need to understand that we will lose a little bit of our autonomy. I'm sorry to all the Sri Lankan foreign policy experts in this country who keep insisting on treating autonomy as some kind of biblical principle that we need to stick to. I'm sorry, but to have alignment with a certain country, there's a certain level of our autonomy which we need to sacrifice. Look, Israel sacrifices a little bit of its autonomy to be intertwined with the United States, but that partnership makes Israel stronger, not weaker. Japan loses some of its autonomy in terms of having the United States as a treaty ally, but that makes Japan stronger, not weaker. So the first thing is we need to understand that we will lose a little bit of our
But
strategic.
we
Yeah,
our
go on.
governments always say that we are non-aligned. So it's a it's not a thing, right? In that
Yeah, so
case,
so we yeah we because we have to go on a long rant about non-alignment because I'm someone who goes against the traditional consensus here on non-alignment. So I need to give your audience a bit of a disclaimer before I get into non-alignment. But if I could just
yeah, yeah.
quickly
Finish your
finish
point.
that
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
finish that previous point. So the basic issue here for us is that we need our priorities to be straight and we need to understand what our foreign policy objectives are. We need some kind of political consensus on what our foreign policy objectives are. A clear bipartisan or multi-partisan agreement on these being in our strategic foreign policy interests. Now, this brings me to non alignment. So, to those of you who are listening, who are in favor of non alignment and all that, let me give you a small warning right now that you might not like what I'm about to tell you, right? So, the typical consensus in Sri Lankan foreign policy thinking, including most of the think tanks and most of the foreign policy conversations that you see in our country, is, I would say, non alignment worship. And what I mean by that is people assuming that non alignment is some kind of almost religious theological doctrine that we must not deviate from. And anybody who says, hey, this non alignment is not actually working, that person will immediately be painted as either an American agent or an Indian agent or a Chinese agent or something like that. The foreign policy discourse here, unfortunately, is designed almost in such a way that anybody who tries to argue against the non alignment consensus is immediately treated with suspicion as the paid agent of some regional or global superpower, right? Now, let's look at the pros and cons of non alignment itself. First of all, as you rightly pointed out, what we have traditionally followed in this country is not non alignment. In fact, we have never, ever been non aligned in our history, particularly the way in which non alignment would be described by any sane person in any other part of the world,
Just because we
right?
had a non-alignment summit doesn't mean we are non-aligned.
Exactly, right. It's that's kind of like the Democratic Republic of Congo calling itself a democracy simply
Yeah.
because the name democratic is in its name, right? The word democratic is anyway. So my point is, when we look at early post-independence Sri Lankan history, When the SLFP was in power, we would be geared towards the Eastern Bloc. When the UNP was in power, we would be geared towards the Western Bloc. If we look at the last 2 or 3 leaders, our foreign policy has changed very drastically based on who the leader is. We in Sri Lanka have a seesaw foreign policy, which is not really a foreign policy at all. And the mask that we use for this is non alignment. We call this non alignment, but it's actually called being clueless, right? And once again, I apologize if this is a bit harsh, but when we go into geopolitical analysis, we need to be quite no nonsense. And unfortunately, this discussion here is filled with nothing but nonsense. So it requires somebody to be provocative and somebody to be confrontational to even get the point through. Now, look at most of the prosperous countries in Asia: Japan, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, Israel, Singapore. You tell me whether these are non aligned countries or aligned countries. Nobody has to believe me. You look through Asia, you come up with a list of countries that you consider to be prosperous, and you tell me, and by you, I mean anybody listening to this who might disagree with this assessment, you tell me whether the prosperous ones are aligned or non-aligned,
Apart from
and you will
the
know the
two
answer.
big countries, no, apart from India and China, you mean, or just the
Yeah,
small
so
ones?
I mean the countries
Yeah.
that are not like nuclear powers who can create their own power center. See, the thing is, I'm glad that you brought it up, because again, many of the so-called experts here would often come and be like, "Oh, but India is strategically autonomous," which once again shows, so their thinking is so limited that they don't understand the difference between a nuclear powers options and a small tiny island nations options. It's all in that emotional egoistic, oh, they can do it, so we can also do it. But till now, when I ask anybody what exactly has the non-aligned movement done for us, it's always wishy-washy answers. In 2022, when we had an economic crisis, imagine, right? So people say non-alignment is this great foreign policy and all that. In 2022, when we went bankrupt, what did this 75 years of great non-aligned foreign policy do for us? Nothing. We were out there, more or less, I'm sorry for using this term, we were out there with a begging bowl, completely at the mercy of nations who were willing to be compassionate to us on their own terms, not on our terms. See, if you had a car, Sanjay, that didn't work for 75 years, I would be like, hey, at some point of time, we've got to call this a useless car, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But we've had this policy for 75 years. We ended up getting absolutely nothing out of it. When we were bankrupt, we had absolutely no friends. And then people are like, no, no, you can't blame the economic crisis on our foreign policy. I'm not doing that. Our economic crisis was due to many other reasons. I agree that they were due to a multitude of many other reasons. But when we went bankrupt, did this 75-year-old foreign policy framework give us even a single friend who was willing to come on our terms? The answer is no. We had ended up alienating everybody. We had no friends. The engagement that we got was on their terms, not on our terms. See, India deserves a lot of credit for rescuing Sri Lanka. That's the only word that we can use. The reason that you and I have lights and all that, and are even able to have this conversation right now, is thanks to the generosity of India. Let's not forget that before this, we had people dying, waiting in queues for bread. We had people dying, waiting in line for gas. That's some Somalia kind of shit, right?
Yeah.
That's not even like third world. This is like failed state. We were at rock bottom. And the fact that we were able to make this recovery is largely thanks to the generosity of other countries, especially India. But my point is that we were not able to demand anything. We were not able to leverage anything because we had nothing. Because non alignment gives you nothing. and yet walk into almost any foreign policy discussion going on in this country right now, whether it's the think tanks or whatever organizations and chambers and all that. It's all about, oh, we need to revive the spirit of Bandung. We need to develop a strategically autonomous policy. We need to protect our tradition of neutrality. That's what you hear. And the level of rational foreign policy discourse in our country is unfortunately at a very, very poor pedestrian level. And I say this as somebody who teaches foreign policy and international relations at many of the IR institutions in this country.
Mm. Yeah, so that's refreshing to hear actually. So we were talking about why India matters, and then we came to the non-aligned movement. So I'm asking. So in that case, if non-alignment brings us nothing, then where should we align to? Is it to a country or a doctrine?
Yeah, so
You tell me.
good. So it has to be one of those things. Either we have strictly defined foreign policy objectives which all the parties agree on, or we align ourselves with a country. It has to be one of these two. It can't be this topsy turvy, flip flop seesaw game that we've been playing over the last 75 years. Either we get all the parties to come together to agree on certain foreign policy fundamentals, or we align with the Chinese or the Americans or the Indians or something like that, and we go for a policy of alignment.
Hmm.
But these are our only two options.
Okay, so that brings me to another question. So in the past, even though we said we are not aligned, our governments were somewhat aligned to different sects or different parties of the world, right? So some were openly favoring China, and some were openly favoring India, America, you name it, in Russia even. And each of these countries at those times have given us certain investments, and as well as their set of footholds in the country, in certain key positions even. So now what happens is when a new government comes, they have to balance these acts. So that's why you are getting pulled to this side as well as on the other side. So how to navigate this then? This is going to be a real puzzle for to solve, right?
So we can navigate this only when there's party consensus on what our foreign policy has to be. This push and pull that you described comes because each new party elected to power comes with a totally new foreign policy that undoes all the foreign policy frameworks laid down by the previous regime. That's the major problem here. There's no continuity per se when we look at engaging with countries. Now, you talk about how all these countries come, but if you speak to the Americans or the Chinese or the Indians, their criticism is, you Sri Lankans are always, this is what they tell me when I try to bring this up with them. They tell me, you Sri Lankans are always in take mode. You're never in give mode. When India or China or the United States comes in here, you take, and then the next party comes in and they say, oh, sorry, boss, the people are angry. We can't really do anything about it. This is supposed to be a new beginning.
This is the
And these
mandate of the
countries,
people.
it's the mandate of the people. Sorry. So we bring guys in, these big giants, and we create a huge fuss about how they are going to arm twist us. And then we break their arms and send them back. Right. Look at all the dreams and hopes that the Americans had with the MCC. We tore that up and flushed it down the toilet. Look at all the dreams and hopes that the Chinese had with the Hambantota port and the port city, how this is going to be a big strategic center of power projection for Beijing and all that. We tore that up and flushed it down the toilet. Repeatedly, the Indians have thought that they were going to come here for a long-term partnership and all that, and repeatedly we tear that and we flush it down the toilet.
And
The
we jeopardize
problem
our relationship with Japan also.
with Japan, right? And all of them have this basic problem that when we have foreign policy discussions, we always speak as if these countries are going to take advantage of us, and we then end up taking advantage of them and sending them backpacking.
So in a way, we are kind of powerful in that sense, no?
No, see, but the result of that is that when we had a crisis like 2022, everybody just said, "Aha, I got you now." Right? I have you by the you know what.
Yeah.
So, but that's the problem with disloyalty in international relations. And if you're non-aligned and you go back and forth, nobody will consider you to be a loyal, reliable foreign policy partner, which is precisely our major problem and challenge at the moment, that everybody will hesitate to take us on as a long-term partner because they know how fragile these supposed long-term partnerships are.
Mm, mm. So, if we are to declare our alliance or allegiance or alignment with a certain power, I think the fear is that we might naturally think that the other powers who are kind of opposed to that power that we are going to align with will generally have bad faith in us and will not provide any future assistance. So, is that why this shifting happens?
Yes, it's the typical Mexican versus Canadian mentality, where the approach is one of negativity and paranoia instead of one of, look, we need to be exploiting India. Let's be clear about it. We need to be taking advantage of India's growth. We need to be the ones who are making a killing out of this big boom that we are seeing right next door. Like how, see, Singapore became developed before China did, but Lee Kuan Yew always predicted that China was going to become a major power and that Singapore, even though it's small, should be poised to take advantage of China's boom. That's why people like him are visionary leaders. They are thinking 40 years, 50 years into the future. So here is that there's unfortunately no far-sighted foreign policy thinker in this country who has political clout, who can actually say, "Hey guys, let's plan how we can exploit India's growth over the next 20 or 30 years." They are not going to lose anything by us distancing ourselves. We are the ones who will lose it out. But once again, as you and I both know, if you stress this point too much, people will immediately start saying this guy's probably getting money from X or Y or Z. So that debate gets shut down again.
Mm. Okay. So let's come back to the AKD's two trips. So he was invited to India before the election in the early part of last year, and then as president, his first visit was to India. Now he's going to China. So coming back to our previous point, so if our leaders think, okay, we are favoring a certain party or we are aligning with a certain party, then the other party will ask something that creates a contradiction between the agreements. So will that happen here, or are these mutually exclusive?
So in some cases, they are mutually exclusive, but in some cases, there will be a clash between what India considers to be a breach of its interests and what China considers to be a breach of its interests. And once again, this is where we need to also point out that this is not a unique challenge for Sri Lanka alone. This is a challenge for every country in the Indian Ocean region. This is a challenge for every country in the South China Sea. This is a challenge for every country in the so-called Indo-Pacific region, right? Where either the power balance between the race between the United States and China or the race between India and China is going to affect you in some way. Once again, we can't be like these typical islanders where we think that the world revolves around us and we look at every problem as a unique Sri Lankan problem. That's another major challenge that we have here. Some of these are global problems that everybody has to deal with. So there are ways in which you can deal with it. Look, ultimately, as long as we are seen as a reliable partner, India will listen to us. Or as long as China sees us as a reliable partner, China will listen to us. The problem is both of them know that we are not reliable. So both of them want to twist the knife and get their demand because they know they can't trust us. This is the fundamental problem. There's a huge lack of trust. And because of that, both India and China need to be quite coercive and pressurizing and confrontational in their demands.
What's their demands?
So, for example, India
What
does
are?
not want these Chinese submarines to come, which India says are research vessels. China says, how can you say they are spy vessels? These are used for legitimate research. Now, actually speaking, that
So
ship,
these are international waters or in Indian waters? What do you? And if the
basically,
submarine comes, how would they detect a submarine has come? That's also another issue, right?
yeah, so there are certain, you can't detect all submarines. Submarine detection is notoriously difficult. But to officially dock a Chinese submarine in a Sri Lankan port, for the Sri Lankan government to officially, on paper, grant permission, that is what India does not want us to do.
So it hasn't
Because
happened so far, no?
but they are going to remove the moratorium now. Our government is now going to remove the moratorium so soon. We don't know, Chinese vessels, research vessels might start coming, right? We have to wait and see. The talk right now is that they will allow the vessels to come. We'll wait and see what actually happens. So my
Okay.
point is that these are the things that any country will have to navigate between either India and China or the United States and China. We can't run away from this. We
Okay.
just need to face it, and we need to come up with maybe SOPs. I think right now they're working on standard operating procedures.
Mhm.
So, guidelines on what kind of vessels can be allowed, what kind of vessels cannot be allowed, and all that, which India and Sri Lanka will draft together,
Mhm.
considering both the security interests mutually.
Mm.
So
Because
once
we are in
that
the same
happens,
region, we kind of act like a. Because we are in the same region, we kind of act like a single unit to grant vessels from other countries, other regions to access this particular area.
yeah, we basically have some standards. You need to meet these standards in order for you to be granted clearance.
So,
So,
for
so that
example, having an Indian officer on a Chinese vessel.
I mean, I don't know whether they would consider that to be quite. They would be maybe even more suspicious if that
Yeah.
happens, right? But as in, it won't just be arbitrary saying no, you can't take them in. You right now it's arbitrary. Right now there are no kind of properly listed out guidelines on what kind of vessels we are okay with entering and what kind of vessels we are not. So once we do that in consultation with the Indians, maybe that problem will be solved. But look, in general, we are going to be caught up in a storm. Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Pakistan, Nepal, the Maldives, and all that, whether we like it or not, we are on a
Pakistan
roller
is
coaster.
also a nuclear power, but still, the
Yeah,
economic wise, they are
Pakistan's
in a bad position.
Pakistan's a nuclear power, but they no longer have any kind of economic might to do this. And Pakistan was never a self-sufficient economy in the sense that Pakistan was always very heavily funded by the Americans. Pakistan's capitalism worked very well, but you've got to also remember that half the Pakistani elite own property in London and Dubai and all that, right? This is Pakistan's major governance crisis at the moment. Most of the Pakistani elite, even if Pakistan goes to the dogs tomorrow, have a second home somewhere else. It's a very dangerous position that Pakistan is in because of the way that it's elite, because Pakistan is still in many ways a very feudal society. Nehru, when he took over, implemented many reforms. And even though Nehru made many economic blunders, Nehru brought in many land reforms and all that, taking away the power from the zamindars, the landlords, the estate owners, the princely states, and things like that. Whereas in Pakistan, this landowning feudal system was preserved. Right. So Pakistan has many internal structural problems as well, and we don't really know what the way out is. Right now, Pakistan is on life support, where people cannot allow Pakistan to collapse. Whether it's China or the Americans or the Russians, you can't just allow Pakistan to collapse, and therefore you need to do something to keep it afloat. Now it looks like a war is going to start this year between the Pakistanis and the Afghans. It's already started on a small scale, but we are potentially looking at a bigger scale engagement in 2025 as well.
Wow. Okay. So we were at the demands of India and China. So So
Hmm.
demands of India, you are not allowed to have any Chinese influence in terms of research or military purposes. So let's go on from there. What are the other
so
demands?
it so that's one of the main contentions. The other basic contention is much more of a macro approach,
Mm,
where they want a guarantee from us. Now they have gotten a guarantee from us
mm,
that we will not do anything which jeopardizes India's security interests, and that more importantly, see, the main thing they wanted us to acknowledge was that our security and their security is intertwined.
mhm,
That's the reason they are pushing the Colombo Security Conclave. That's the reason that there are so many talks of unity and connectivity and all that. The basic thing the Indians want is for us to acknowledge that there are lots of common interests here: security interests, economic interests,
mm,
energy interests. And I think to a certain extent, they feel that AKD has given them
mm,
those assurances.
mm.
Now the
So
trick
none
comes
of the
now.
previous governments, Ranil or Gotabe or Sirisena, they haven't given that assurance.
They all gave the assurance. They all gave the assurance. But like I said, because of the topsy-turvy foreign
Mm,
policy uh, 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 system that we have,
mm,
it was never really something that was preserved through to the end,
mm,
right? So, which was the point that I was coming to. But now, when AKD goes to China and comes back,
mm,
what kind of statements is he going to make from China? What kind of impact is that going to have when they come back? Right? All of this. And look, I am not anti-China, right, by any means. I feel that if the popular consensus is that we need to go with China, let's go with China. My point is that we need to pick one person, and we need to stick with that person over a period of time for the foreign policy to start benefiting us. That's my
mm,
only point. Now, the only reservation I have about China is that when there's a crisis, let's take the 2022 crisis as an example. Okay, in India, look at the news coverage of our 2022 crisis in the Indian media, where it was all about sympathy. People were like, oh my God, so sad. We need to help them. We need to send money. We need to send food. We need to send a line of credit, blah, blah, blah. There was an outpouring of sympathy from India. In China, this was seen as a very clinical news story, just another news story of just another country in some other part of the world
mm,
collapsing.
mm,
It's
mm,
not like they were glorifying it or they were making fun of us or anything like that. It was nothing
mm,
mean
mm,
spirited.
mm,
But to them, it was just another news
mm,
story
mm,
of just it was covered in a very
mm,
clinical,
mm,
official,
mm.
journalistic way.
So
So that itself should.
For Indians, it was like losing or something happening to their friend or a relative. For the
It
Chinese,
was an
it's someone,
emotional issue.
yeah, someone that you don't know.
Perfect, right? And that's the difference between a relative and a business partner.
Mm,
China will always engage with us as a business partner, but not as a relative. I'm not saying that because of this, China must be set aside.
mm,
I'm just pointing out that for the most successful long-term partnerships in international relations are where there's cultural synergy as well. If you don't have cultural synergy, it's very, very difficult for that partnership to be successful, right? And this is what the West understands very, very well, which is why the Americans are able to build long lasting partnerships all over the world, because they understand in the cultural power. See, if you go to Japan or South Korea and all that, American movies run there in the theaters for just as long as the local movies.
mm,
Right? Their pop culture is crafted and shaped almost entirely by American popular
mm,
culture.
mm,
Israel as well.
mm,
The United Kingdom and the United States are the best example, the Anglo
mm,
American example. When
mm,
there is cultural synergy, is when you have the most mutually beneficial
mm.
partnerships.
So United States was able to pull that off, maybe because it was formed by all these European powers, separate European powers coming together as a country back in the day.
No, but that was in 1776, right? And
Yeah.
plus, it was mostly German and British lineage anyway. But the Americans entered world politics only in the 1940s.
With the
So,
World
yeah,
War.
they played a small role in the First World War, certainly, but they were an isolationist power. It was only in the 1940s that they even started engaging with the world on like the scale that they do today. The basic answer is that because they know that wealth and fun is something that people like. See, the American foreign policy is based a lot, American soft power and American culture. A lot of people insult it as being too materialistic, too shallow, too money minded, too immoral, and all that. But the unfortunate reality is that human beings are petty, human beings are fun seeking, human beings are materialistic, human beings are immoral. Whenever you take quote unquote Western culture and insert it into a country, it grows. I don't want to use the virus analogy, but it grows like a virus because it's just it's
It's just
something that
catering to your desires.
exactly,
It
it's
fuels your
something that
desires.
caters to humanity's desires, which is why capitalism always succeeds over communism, but communism always comes back in some new phase and then loses again. It'll Marxism, communism, socialism, new whatever, democratism, environmentalism. Now all this DEI, diversity, whatever, inclusivity,
Environmental, yeah.
whatever. Communism will keep
ESG.
coming in. Yeah, right. The ESG, it'll keep coming back in some form or the other because communism caters to a utopian ideal. So on paper, it's very easy to get young people to follow communism and any kind of leftist thought because it's all about justice, equality, building a good society, holding the exploitative classes accountable. So communism rhetorically can win over young people very easily, which is why many people, I mean, all of us have gone through a socialist or communist phase when we were in college or something like that, right? It's almost like a rite of passage. Of course, some people never grow out of it, but more or less all of us who are involved in
So seems like you are not
politics.
a fan of communism or socialism.
No. I wouldn't say. So here's the thing, right? I wouldn't say I consider them to be bad. I'm just saying at some point of time we need to look at the data. See, when you look at a country like Korea and you split it into North Korea and South Korea, or when you take Germany and when you split it into East Germany and West Germany, or when you take China and you split it into the Republic of China and Taiwan, you have many, many clear cut cases where the same people, same ethnicity, same diet, same skin color, same language, same everything have been bifurcated based on communism and capitalism. And in all the cases, the capitalist side, whether this is West Germany or Taiwan or South Korea, ends up becoming one of the richest places in the world. And the communist incarnations end up becoming complete sort of platforms for bankruptcy, poverty, the worst kind of deprivation. In the North Korean example, you don't find West German refugees running into East Germany. You find East German refugees fleeing into West Germany. You don't find South Koreans digging tunnels to somehow get into North Korea. You get North Koreans digging tunnels to get into South Korea, right? So I don't have anything conceptually against communism or socialism. I
But
just feel that
basically on based on what we can observe.
exactly, we need to be quite data driven in our conclusions as well. And my major problem with pro communist, pro socialist thought is that it is not data driven at all. It's all very emotional.
Okay. Okay. Uh, okay. So it's nice. It's kind of like we need to discuss it even a little bit more in a separate podcast. So I think
Yeah.
there's a lot of content for us to cover there.
By the way, on the point of India, can I just point out one more thing? So you could argue that one of the first capitalism, communism dichotomies was in ancient India. If you think about it, Chanakya or Kautilya was a capitalist. Ashoka was a communist. Ashoka is basically maybe the world's first actual communist, where you go fully into the welfare state and you believe that the wealth must be redistributed almost to a T into society, and that creating economic equality should be the major role of distributing resources. Chanakya or Kautilya, on the other hand, he believed in having trade guilds, he believed in having copyright laws, he believed that the role of the state must be to provide certain services to entrepreneurs to make certain things possible, but that entrepreneurship should be the leading force of the economy rather than the state controlling everything. So this actual capitalism communism dichotomy goes back thousands of years, even before the words capitalism and communism were invented. This is an age old economic debate.
So can't there be both? Can't I mean, cannot a government implement certain aspects of capitalism and some aspects of communism or socialism on a case by case basis, or a or if you take a certain scenario, okay, this is where capitalism thrives, so we should apply capitalist principles on that particular subject, and then for this perhaps maybe we should think of socialism or communism. What do you think?
Yeah, see, the thing is, so most countries are a mix of the two, right? There are no purely capitalist countries in the world where there is no public sector at all. Even in a capitalist country, there will be government hospitals. There'll be so look at the British Railways, right? Or the Pentagon, right? Now these are all things that those respective countries will always have. It's not going to go to the free market, even in any of our countries, right? In whether this is Sri Lanka from our perspective, or let's say
Health, education,
Bangladesh or
transportation.
Maldives, there will always be an element of government public spending as well. So yes, a mix of the two is something that is required in any functional economy anyway. But
But
the
leaning towards
question
capitalists if you want to get rich.
exactly, if you want, as many economists have said before, capitalism makes people unequally rich. Communism makes people equally poor, right? So
That's a good one.
when if we want to create prosperity, then human history teaches us that entrepreneurship is unfortunately the only path to prosperity. If you're looking at a society, you can go through the ambit of human history from the eastern to the western hemisphere, and entrepreneurship is the only viable, realistic way for a culture, for a society to become economically prosperous in the long run, right? So, as far as we are concerned, right now, we need to be using countries like India to to facilitate an entrepreneurship boom. Now, I know you do a lot of work with Sri Lankan entrepreneurs and all that. Now, just imagine if there was a actual culture of entrepreneurship which was allowed to blossom and prosper here. We know so many young, eager minds in our own country who are willing to now jump into the arena and to make money and to work hard and to bring new types of products and services into the marketplace. But the capital is simply not there. The opportunities are simply not there. We have not industrialized our economy. Our biggest sources of income, if I'm not mistaken, are remittances, nothing to do with industrial capacity. It's all about sending your people abroad. Apparel, right? Once again, very low, extremely low end manufacturing, mostly to the American markets. You have tea, which once again is not an industrial product, it's a thing that you
Yeah,
harvest
those
through
are very
estates. And
primary industries anyway.
yeah, raw
Mm,
materials, right? And
mm,
our
mm,
tea industry, can you believe it? Despite having all these tea estates and all that, our tea industry only brings in some $2 billion or something
mm,
like that. So there's tea, there's tourism. Once
mm,
again, nothing to do with industrial capacity. And then I think the last one is our IT
mm,
services consultancies. I think we make some money, right?
mm.
But
Not
we
that much,
are
about
not.
1.5 billion.
Yeah. So, but by the standards of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
rest,
yeah.
so
Mm,
this I think is like the top five
mm,
of our money makers. So we are not an income generating country, as simple as that. And for us to become an income generating country, we need to exploit the growth of some other economy which is now booming,
okay.
and that has to be the Indian market, in my opinion. It can be the
Okay.
Chinese market if
Mm,
that's what the public want, but
mm,
there will be many more caveats that come with Chinese investments as well.
okay. All right. So again, since we are on that subject, so the current government always talks about the production economy, and how they are going to approach is via a mix of government intervention as well as private enterprise. So they want SOEs to perform to a certain extent, and they want to create certain SOEs. I mean, they are resurrecting certain SOEs to restart the businesses that have been gone down and under. For example, this Triposha factory that they were currently looking to revitalize. And then we have the private investors and the private entrepreneurs. So which path should the government take according to what you are seeing here? I mean, I
See,
get what you mean, but for the
yeah,
society as
yeah.
a whole to understand.
Yeah. So I think at this point I'm quite a firm believer in free market economics. I'm quite a firm believer that as long as we can keep an eye on certain things, we can certainly uh, create some kind of industrial output in this country. Look, if you notice, nobody ever complains about the quality of our skilled labor. Even the people who complain about our economic output and the lack of industrial power, Sri Lankan skilled workers, typically we tend to
Mm,
be quite good,
mm, mm,
right? But it's just that we don't have access to enough markets, and we don't have our own money making capacity to now give all these people an edge, either
mm,
in products or services or things like that. So I think we need to go down the free market route, not an extreme free market route, but a somewhat
mm,
pro
mm,
free market route,
mm,
where we create a sense of entrepreneurship
mm,
in the country. And this is where India comes
mm,
in. I say this
mm,
to Indian media as well, because as you know, I get interviewed quite regularly by Indian media outlets as well. And all I keep telling them in every interview, if you guys really want
mm,
Sri Lanka to be pro India, then
mm,
you need to create a generation of Sri Lankan entrepreneurs who got rich with your money.
mm,
Just like how the South Korean youth can actually see American wealth playing a role in how rich they are, just like how in some parts of the Muslim world they see how Saudi Arabian money is making them rich, right? The younger generation of Sri Lanka has to be able to see the visible impact of Indian money helping them make money.
mm, mm,
So for this, India needs to give Sri Lankan entrepreneurs good access to Indian markets. India needs to help Sri Lanka increase its industrial output. Sri Lankans need to be cognizant of India's worries when dealing with us. See, for example, now we say, no, we don't like Adani. We don't want Adani here. See, but the problem is all countries have private companies as their foreign investment partner.
mm,
China has foreign investment
mm,
private partners, the United States has them, and people like Adani and Ambani happen to be the Indian government's partners.
mm,
So if we say no to Adani, that means we are going to stay poor. We are
mm,
not going to be able to benefit from the economic growth of India one bit. It's just not going to happen. In fact, the reason why the Indian government even started really understanding the need to have people like Adani is because of the Hambantota port. When we offered the Hambantota port to the Indians, as you know, and the Indians said no, they said no because they knew that the MEA, the Ministry of External Affairs, would not be able to move quickly and mobilize quickly on a project like this. This is why countries have private multinational corporations to be their foreign investment partner, because a private entity can move very quickly and move very flexibly. So they said for this to not happen, we now need to have big billionaires in our country who can make these investments all over the world, and they will be Indian
So
investments.
after the Hambant report incident, they only realized this problem.
So at the Hambantota thing really emphasized this problem, because you never really
Mm,
had a big see at that. Now you have Adani ports and all that,
mm,
Adani ports. But back then, under the
mm,
Manmohan Singh government, India did not have any of that. Right? It was the
mm,
first clear case of a project being offered to India,
mm.
India turning it down because it thought
Because of
it lacked
okay, wow.
capacity, and then the Chinese come in, and then now India is
Mm,
forced to come and grab our collar again. We are like, what did we do?
mm,
We are like, we offered it to you guys. You guys didn't want it, so
mm,
we went to the Chinese.
mm.
And New Delhi was like, never again. We
Mm.
too will
Ah,
have certain
okay.
private sector entities
Okay, that
who's
connects
willing
a
to
lot
go
of
in.
dots actually. That connects a lot of dots. Do you want to go? Actually, it's kind of like past 9 now.
Yeah, so if you have any more questions, I'm
Okay,
more than
I'll
happy to discuss them.
let's finalize it within 5 minutes, and then obviously we need to look at the AKD's visit and the agreements in a more detailed manner. So we cannot do that in a hurry. Let's do it on other podcast. What I would ask at this point is that what happens in the India was offered to do the railway after the war, to create the railway from I think from Vaunia to Jaffna or something. So isn't so they I think they picked it up. So that was a project that they could manage by the government, and the port was not managed. I mean, they couldn't handle the capacity. Is that correct?
Exactly, because the port would have required a lot of industrial capacity in that sector,
Hmm.
which the foreign ministry was not willing to go in
So
at
the
that time.
corporations are powerful than governments.
It's not that they're powerful, it's that they have the speed and the flexibility to move quickly, which a government bureaucracy does not have.
Hmm.
See, even
Yeah. Yeah.
China, well known for its government's efficiency, even China uses
Hmm.
private companies
Hmm.
for this precise
But the
purpose.
governments have ownership of these companies, so to a certain
Yeah,
extent.
there will be a certain level of ownership and all that, but they'll be
Hmm.
run as private companies.
Hmm. Hmm. Hmm.
You see, so this is an international practice of superpowers all over the world, where the private sector, and this is once again a historical fact of all great powers, where you have the private sector. In the old days, it would be like a merchant guild, a traders guild, or something like that. So these
Hmm.
days it's more like a multinational corporation and all that. So so for example, we can't say no to McDonald's if you want to be a pro USA country. You McDonald's, Coca-Cola, these countries will all come if you're going to be a US aligned country.
Unless your local partner screws up so bad, the McDonald's decides to leave and keep the rest of their friends here.
Yeah, unless they're like, oh, you know what, we'll pay you for us to stay away.
Okay. So what we've been discussing in this particular podcast, or in particular, is that what I say is that as Sri Lankans, our understanding or our vision or how we see other countries and how we see international business, how we see international governments operate with their business partners, partner companies, and how they implement projects in other countries. So we don't really understand any of it. Most of our people do not have an idea of how governments navigate, how the governments negotiate. So I think this is a good eye opener, because we can learn a lot from how to with all this information on how we should negotiate as a country, as well as how our leaders should navigate these I would say challenging waters in terms of geopolitics. So
Yeah,
there will
if I could just
yeah.
quickly add one more point, and I would like all our viewers to remember that the point of these discussions is not to push anybody towards any particular country. The point of these discussions is to bring in a rational, logical discussion about foreign policy, which is unfortunately lacking in our country because there are many, many vested interests involved. So, the point of these geopolitics conversations is not to push anybody towards the USA or towards India or towards China. It's to encourage everybody to look at the facts in an objective and logical way and come up with their own conclusions.
and be rational, and when a logical approach is being taken, to support it rather than criticizing it, pulling it back. So that's
Exactly.
where that's the only way we can move forward. So having said that, we'll stop the podcast for today, and we'll get Nilan back as soon as possible to discuss this further, as well as our other more technical subjects. So thank you, Nilan. I'll let you go and have a nice night and a nice weekend.